So for today's NTOR live webinar, we'll be looking at marine molluscs, and I'm delighted to welcome Simon Taylor from the Conchological Society's Marine Mollusc Recording Scheme. And he's going to tell us about his experiences as National Recorder for Marine Molluscs and some of the fantastic records and data that they've been getting in over more than a couple of years, I believe. So over to you, Simon, to tell us all about the Marine Mollusc Recording Scheme.
Thank you, Kieran. I hope this is going to work. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, my name is Simon. Good. My name is Simon Taylor. I am my official role title is Marine Census Recorder for the Conchological Society of Great Britain and Ireland. It's an entirely voluntary amateur role. I'm an amateur naturalist. First, get a little bit philosophical about recording. I don't know if anyone's seen this quote before from T.S. Eliot, but for me, it sums up what we're trying to achieve when we do recording and kind of the philosophy behind recording. So just how what has been affects what will be, and it all goes around in circles. But anyway, let's get more scientific. So Mollusca, phylum Mollusca, the most diverse marine phylum. So the arthropods cannot compete when it comes to the marine. And they have extreme plasticity of form. You can see the four images over to the right there. At the top is a chiton, which is a mollusk, which has 8 plates, 8 shelly plates instead of a single shell. It's kind of like a cross between a limpet and a woodlouse, really, but it is 100% mollusk and entirely marine as well. At the bottom, an octopus. A lot of people forget that cephalopods are mollusks, and octopuses, extremely advanced, very intelligent organisms, intelligent even by vertebrate standards, and certainly the most intelligent invertebrates, very clever things. So there are 7 classes of 7 extant classes of mollusks, 1, possibly 2 extinct classes. All are marine, and the phylum is a very old one, goes right back to before the Cambrian explosion. 2 of the classes have evolved to survive in fresh water, and only 1, the gastropods, has evolved to be terrestrial. You see a terrestrial snail there on the right, and a freshwater clam. So the Conchological Society, or ConchSoc as everyone calls it, marine dataset, currently contains 205,087 records spread across 791 taxa. Now, how many marine taxa there are, or marine mollusk taxa there are to record is open to conjecture. It depends how far out into the ocean you go and how deep you go. So it's not like it's confined to a single area like terrestrial recording is, where you can be fairly certain about how many taxa there are to record. But we're in, I think, probably getting on for 1,000 once you really get down to the abyssal depth of the ocean, probably more. So the talk I've got for you today kind of divided up into 3 parts. The first part gives you some historic context to the marine recording scheme. The second part tells you a bit more about what we do to record marine mollusks and how we gather the data. And then in the third part, I'll give you a few case studies, introduce you to a few species. Some of you may be more familiar with them. They may be completely new to some people. Okay, well, the Conchological Society itself, the Conchological Society of Great Britain and Ireland, was originally formed in Leeds in 1876, a group of like-minded friends who decided to meet fortnightly. Actually, the journal that the Society still produces predates the Society itself by a couple of years. It was issued by Messrs. Taylor and Nelson, and printed themselves. John Taylor was, as well as being a student of molluscs, he was professionally, I believe, a printer. So producing the journal was a bit of a busman's holiday for him. And he circulated it to his friends, and they decided that they would get together and meet. In 1888, other local groups were proposed, and one split off to form the Malacological Society of London, which is still going today. Another very old society in this country concerned with molluscs. In 1895, the journal was adopted as the Society's formal publication with a nominated editor. And you can see on the right-hand side there some copies, fairly recent copies. They're from the 1970s, those ones, but I took a photograph of them because I like the orange colour. And one of our special publications on the bottom there. So by 1895, the Society was already census recording non-marine molluscs. The original founders of the Society were more focused perhaps on non-marine. And just a note at the bottom there, the 1903 AGM was held in Dublin, so the Irish links were established early on. There have been 100 years of marine recording within the Conchological Society, celebrating it either last year or this year, depending on how you interpret the old reference. But, the Society's president at the time, in 1974, did an address to kind of celebrate 100 years of the Society, and it was around the Society's history. And he noted that Tomlin, there's Tomlin there, John Reed Le Brockton Tomlin, resplendent in his three-piece tweed suit, suggested in 1922 the practicability of a marine census along the line of that existing for non-marine species. Proposed that it should be based on Winkworth's list. We'll find out more about that shortly. And Winkworth himself agreed to work out the details. One immediate result was the creation of the Office of Marine Recorder, which I currently hold. But a year later, all that Winkworth had to report was a complete lack of interest. So he got off to a slow start. The chronology of marine recorders. There's Winkworth. I said we'd meet him. His dates. He was the first of 10 marine recorders to span the 100-year period of marine recording. So it's been a post which people have held for periods of time. Some of you may recognise some of the names on there. Nora Macmillan published quite a famous book on British shells. David Heppell did a lot of work, not just on molluscs. Stella Turk, great Cornish recorder. Sheila Smith, great Scottish recorder. Phil Palmer from the Natural History Museum. Dennis Seaward, who we will see more of later. And my predecessor, Jan Light, who held the role for 20 excellent years. She did some great work. And there she is with me. We had a kind of formal passing of the baton on Filey Brig in 2013 when my arm was twisted sufficiently for me to take the role. So, census recording, just a little bit about it. Put it in context. It, as it says there, it creates lists of species recorded in defined areas, such as the Watsonian Vice Counties, which those who are more familiar with terrestrial recording will recognise, and there they are all shown on the map. Very basic stuff here for people. I'm sure it's not new to most. Talking about a biological record or a taxon occurrence or a taxon observation, they're all the same thing. But one of the rules that people trot out nowadays is that to be a biological record, you've got to comply with 4 W's. So we need a who recorded it, what they recorded, where they recorded it, and when they recorded it. Some people record null records, which is where you note the absence of a particular taxon. Within the society, we don't accept null records. They can be useful in certain cases, but they can cause a lot of confusion as well. And then a more modern concept is the verification of records. In years past, a lot of recording was made and was just accepted. The fact that someone said, "I've seen this at such and such a time," okay, fine, and it was like no questions asked. Whereas nowadays, to clarify and to make sure that the data is correct, it's generally accepted that it's good to have someone else confirm, someone with sufficient knowledge to be able to confirm that the record is correct. That leads on to ideas of data purity, which we'll come back to later. Right, some of that history that I was telling you about. Census recording had been going on within marine molluscs, or the Conchological Society decided to do it back in the 1920s. And these 4 eminent Victorian gentlemen all did marine mollusk census recording. I don't know if any of you recognise any of them. You might recognise names as I reveal them. So there's Forbes, who with Sylvanus Hanley produced a set of volumes called British Conchology. British Mollusca. Joshua Alder, he worked with a chap called Albany Hancock, and Alder and Hancock did some excellent work on the nudibranchs, the marine sea slugs, much of which still very, very valid today. John Gwynne Jeffreys, he was a very active dredger and name-up species. Unfortunately, his extensive collection, which included a lot of type material, now resides in the Smithsonian Institutes in America and in Britain. He produced a set of 5 volumes, which British Conchology, which included non-marine as well. He was really across the spectrum. And Philip Henry Goss, who in some circles is more famous for the book his son wrote about his upbringing, which really didn't paint Mr. Goss in a terribly good light, but he was an excellent marine biologist, probably better than he was a father, but there we go, that's a different story. Here's an example of, taken from Jeffreys' British Conchology, particular species, Marshallora adversa. That wasn't the name that Jeffreys used, but there's a figure from Jeffreys on the right there and a photograph of a modern specimen on the left, and an extract from the text on the species that Jeffrey gives. And you can see that he mentions several occurrences of this species in particular places. And that really is census recording, although he doesn't give dates. So, you could argue that one of the 4 W's is missing, but it provides some sort of basis, so you know that by the time that Jeffreys was publishing, that this species had been found at Dunbar by Lasky. Also, in Victorian times, pre-Conchsoc marine recording, we had some deep water dredging going on to the west of Britain and elsewhere. This was motivated, as I'm sure some of you know, by the theory that in the deep seas there was no life. Sunlight couldn't penetrate, so there could be no food chain. People disputed this. and quite rightly so, as was discovered by cruises made by the Porcupine and by the Challenger, which did an awful lot of dredging, pulled up a lot of material from the seabed from some great depths in some cases, and found a huge diversity of life. The chap at the bottom left there, Charles Wyville Thompson, had an awful lot of letters after his name. He was charged with writing a lot of this up, and it was a huge task. And apparently he was quite a delicate disposition, and he wasn't quite able to complete it before it saw him off, unfortunately. But there's a couple of volumes there that he did produce. But later the whole thing was written up. It took decades to do it, but the references that were produced are still very, very useful. So a society list was produced, again, before it started having a formal marine recording scheme. A list of taxa, British marine molluscs, prepared by a committee, so probably wasn't entirely correct. And you can see on the right there the area that they chose to consider as the area that British would be considered as British for their purposes. It's a rather odd shape, as you can see. You can see it partly arranged just around the lines of latitude and longitude. Funny wiggly bit in the bottom left is sort of more working around the bottom corner of Ireland there. One of the rules of thumb they used to use was that they considered the 100-fathom line to be the line at which, beyond which, you weren't really recording British molluscs. And a lot of work was done. That list was taken, and this is an example of an old notebook I've got in my possession, where they've interleaved that early list with just some loose paper, and made lots and lots of notes about records that were made. Makes very interesting reading, and some of the data can be used. Although, again, as you can see, there's very little given in the way of dates, but you can trawl through it and you can glean some useful information. By 1929, you can see that Winkworth was still plugging away, but there was still very little interest being shown in his fledgling marine mollusk recording scheme. But he himself produced a list, and you recall that was the list that was referred to when they proposed to commence this marine recording scheme. And it was published in the Journal of Conchology there. It was his presidential address, as I believe. It focused interests, and things started to take off. And lists based on sea areas were compiled. So these were census lists. They weren't dot maps or anything like that. It was just a list of species found in particular areas. There's some details from Winkworth's list. Contained 598 taxa. So the number of taxa, as I described earlier, has increased significantly. Not all due to invasives, I hasten to add. Moving on to the marine areas then. David Heppell published this in '64. He was another of the holders of the post of marine recorder. And on the right there, you can see a plan showing various numbered areas. They were the sea areas being considered. You can see marked to the west of Britain and Ireland there, the 100-fathom line. And again, a sort of arbitrary lines made up from the lines of latitude and longitude. And then you've got the 1,500-fathom line skirting around to join up to form like a strip of continental shelf beyond Western Ireland there. So Heppell was proposing that as well as the sea areas, you'd have this large area just called the North Atlantic area, which was kind of like our bit of continental shelf, as it were. So these are the sea areas that we ended up with. I know it's not the best picture, but I hope you can make out some of the detail. They're familiar to, well, reasonably familiar to anyone who listens to the ship cast. They're not identical, but they do share some characteristics. You'll recognise some of the names there. You can see that some of them are quite large, some of them are very small. We have sneaked in a few bits of the French coast as well. And many of you will be familiar with similar versions of these recording cards, which were produced for various different taxon groups. See, the marine mollusk one is quite large. It's quite a large number of taxa. It was two-sided, and of course it doesn't include everything. These are just the common ones. But it was very, very useful, and it really helped to focus people's minds when it came to recording. Dennis Seaward, the Jan Light's predecessor as marine recorder, he collated an awful lot of this information. He was very good at pulling all sorts of information sources together, and he made a series of publications which really were the peak of the Conchological Society's census recording efforts. Firstly, what he did was he published a number of master lists for the sea areas. So these were census recording, in essence. So it's the entire list of species which have been found within those areas up to that date. Say when they were recorded or exactly where, just which species were recorded within those areas. You'll notice beside them there are letters, because one of the things almost peculiar to mollusk recording, certain groups of mollusks anyway, is of course they have shells which are quite long-lived. So you can record their presence even a while after the animal has died. So you then really have to determine between live records and shell-only records. Or as they did back then, they had an A, B, and C scale. So A was live, B was fresh dead, and C was really rather old and worn. Seaward then went on to produce these census maps showing dots within the sea areas. A dark dot meant a recent live record. A half-shaded dot meant an old live record, and an open dot meant a shell-only record. So this is perhaps his most famous publication, the Sea Area Atlas, which had a map for each species and that information for them all. There is Mr. Seaward. There's not many photographs that I'm aware of him. He was very much based in Dorset, and that's a picture of him in a rowing boat on the Fleet. And that's his final publication there on the left, which added a little bit more detail to his previous atlas and expanded it really to cover Northwest Europe. And that was like his masterwork, after which I think he felt he'd done all he could and made way for Jan. Now, that previous publication was published in 1990. Now, as early as 1979, other people, David McKay and Sheila Smith, were producing dot maps. These ones, their dots were based on these ICES rectangles, which need to get this right. They are a degree of longitude and half a degree of latitude part of the world, which makes them, because of the stretching, roughly square. And so they can then be subdivided into 25. So you can get some relatively small squares, which, as described there, are 12 minutes of longitude and minutes of latitude. And there's some examples given there of the sorts of maps which McKay and Smith were producing much good, same time as Dennis Seaward was producing his census recording map. And Dennis recognised that. There's a quote from him: "The information in these publications is qualitative rather than quantitative. As the sea areas are so large and unequal in size, these atlases accentuate the failing of all dot maps. One dot may equally indicate one individual in or abundance throughout the units of area chosen." So then we reached the end of the 20th century, and it was all changed really with computerization. You can accurately plot things. At the same time, the Data Protection Act came in, and various recording schemes, not just ours, tied themselves in knots about data protection, about intellectual property, and it caused a bit of a furore. And the collapse of the sea area system, or sea area rep system anyway, because they had representatives in each of the sea areas who were kind of collating the records from those areas. And some of them really took umbrage about the way that things were being organised in light of the Data Protection Act. I even have heard stories of people burning record cards in protest. It was a difficult time. But there were lots of positives with the introduction of digital photography, the internet, scuba, commercial techniques became far more advanced. We had GPS. There were lots and lots of good things happening at the time. Plus, environmental legislation meant that oil and gas exploration were having to do much more in terms of surveying of the sea, where they were working. And the Conchological Society expanded its remit really to cover the Northeast Atlantic province. And it started using Recorder 6 to digitally note all its records based on SQL. I'm sure many of you use Recorder 6 or similar software. There's a screenshot from it. It shows you the sort of detail which we go down to. And we can use grid references or latitude and longitude, as you can see there. There's details of the data hierarchy within the system. We won't go into that in too great detail. Okay, so that gives you some background as to where we are now. Now let's find out how we gather our data. All the different ways are listed there. Fieldwork, obviously, both shore and offshore. Benthic sampling, harvesting data from old record cards and some digital sources. Also, our membership continues to submit records, and we also glean records from other online resources, which we'll talk about later. So fieldwork, there we are. There are some conchologists working on the shore, and you'll notice that the tide is well and truly out. What we call the laminaria or the kelp zone is exposed. So we are lucky in our country to have quite a large tidal range, and we target our coastal fieldwork times spring tides, when the tide goes out an awful long way. And some things that are only exposed very, very infrequently are available to see. And what techniques do we use on the shore? Well, it's important that you check all available habitats. It's all too easy when you've got these very low tides to just rush down to the water's edge, spend your whole time there, and forget about the rest of the shore. And there are some species that you'll only find in the splash zone, or perhaps even above the splash zone. That's the area that never gets completely submerged by the sea. It just gets splashed. And in caves, caves in cliffs at the top of the shore are a recognised habitat for certain specialist species. I've mentioned that we target spring tides. We sample algae. You take algal samples, take them back, take them offshore or even onshore. You can look at them in trays, see what's crawling around on them. But you can take them away and do what we call weed washing, where you soak them in fresh water, which is a destructive technique, but it's a very effective one. It all the molluscs which are on the weeds fall off, and then you can sieve them out of the water. Similarly, rock scraping. Shell grit is a very good resource. It gets deposited on the shore, particularly on sandy beaches in ripples, and you can take it away. You can look at it under the microscope, and you can gather an awful lot of data from that. You have to bear in mind that it's not in situ data. You can't be entirely sure how far these shells have been transported, but generally you can be fairly sure that it's not terribly far. But if you note that you're recording from shell grit, then that's fair enough. Stone turning is a very useful technique. I'm sure anyone who does any sort of marine coastal recording will know that stone turning is productive. And we try and we get excited on shores where there's lots of turning over stones. On more sedimentary shores, shall we say, sandy, muddy shores, digging is obviously a good technique. Sieving the sediments or kick sampling, something that freshwater workers do as well. And going back to what I was saying about verification, it's useful to either photograph or take a voucher specimen of what you're finding. Shell grits, there's someone collecting shell grit, one of my colleagues, Rosemary, on the beach, almost literally in the shadow of Bamburgh Castle up in Northumberland. The society was up there last summer. So offshore techniques, there I am, looking rather pleased with myself, holding a dredge. We use small naturalist dredges, and we tend to look to go out on these little creel boats, as we call them, the sort where that they go out for the day, pulling crab and lobster pots. The most important thing is that they have a hydraulic winch, because boiling up that dredge when it's full of sediment is very hard work. I mean, they're heavy when they're empty. They have to be, otherwise they don't go down to the bottom. Once they're full, they're even heavier. There's better views of the dredge. You can see basically it's a stainless steel rectangle, about 45 centimeters long by about 15 wide, held by two arms which are connected to a length of heavy chain to make it sink, and then connected to the rope. And behind the dredge box is a net. The green net there is just to protect the fine net within. We also do grab sampling. There's a Van Veen grab in the foreground, and some happy conchologists in the background. We, as a society, we actually have our own Van Veen grab, not that one. So we are equipped to go out and do grab sampling whenever we want. And those are the sorts of samples that we dredge up. That's ideally what we want, is a mixture of substrates. So we've got some lovely mud in the foreground there, really gloopy stuff. And then behind in the red trug, there's some sand with lots and lots of brittle stars in. Then we've got a stony sample, and then a lovely mixed sample of gravel and shells, which will have an awful lot of species in. We also, where we can, we obtain samples from sources like research vessels. The vessel at the top is the Scotia, Scottish Research Vessel. It's actually got a species of mollusc named after it, which was discovered in one of the samples that it provided. And the bottom there is a commercial whitefish trawling boat, but even the guys who run those occasionally collect samples for us to look at and find very interesting things. We also get samples from divers, and top left there is the diver handing over a sample that they've collected from subtidal waters, handing it over to one of our members who's only too happy to receive it. And what do we do with these samples? Well, top right, sieving. We do an awful lot of sieving in our line, and if we're booking a property to stay in to do some of this field work, then one of the key things that we look out for is an outside tap, help us with our sieving. And bottom left there, you can see that that's the sort of stuff that we end up with, lots of bags full of sieved samples. So one of those big trucks of material will sieve down to maybe just a litre or so of actual sample, which then, bottom right, we spend ages looking at under a microscope to pick out all the tiny molluscs that are in there. Underwater photography is a technique where we get an awful lot of data as well. The divers' equipment and their photographic equipment has got very sophisticated, and they do really love their sea slugs, the nudibranchs. There's a couple of very photogenic species there. Amphrena farinae and Phaseolina auriculata. There are even, people think that the British wildlife is not as spectacular as all the tropical stuff, but we have some pretty spectacular sea slugs in our waters. There's some examples of the old recording cards filled in. You can just about make out some of the details there. These are from like the 70s and 80s. They don't always, but these ones do match the 4 Ws. So you've got the dates, you've got, who the recorder is, and you've got an accurate location. So they're not just a census record when they say, it's area or whatever, which unfortunately quite a lot of them do. And I also know that the old census recorders, quite often they'd get one of these cards and they'd ignore all the records, which they'd already got records of from that whole area, and just focus on the 1 or 2 that were new to that area. So a lot of data was missed out on, but we're digitizing these where we can, and that's added a lot of data to our system. Okay, iRecord. I'm sure many of you use iRecord. I principally use iRecord as a verifier, along with a colleague of mine, Ian Smith, who does an awful lot of verification on iRecord. And once we've verified that these records are correct, they're correctly identified species, they're in the right place, etc., then and we add value to them for the recorder by saying, yeah, you're right. And then in most cases, we add the data to our data set as well. We also do that with the website iNaturalist, which mainly nowadays links up through iRecord. We also have Facebook groups. There's a screenshot from the British Marine Mollusca Facebook group, which I'm an admin of. And we get a lot of interest and a lot of data through that as well. Okay, what happens to the data? Well, ultimately, it gets shared publicly via the National Biodiversity Network Atlas. And that's a plot of all our marine mollusk data. You see it's spread far and wide, actually spread further and wider than that now because we've got more data to share with them. So taking an example of a particular species, Lacuna vincta, banded chink shell, that's the page from the NBN Atlas. So 2,975 records, you can see. Well, actually, it says more, but I think they're duplicates. Spread all over, but that's the data from all the data partners who share their data with NBN, and you can filter just to see the Conchological Society data, which is what I there. So all those dots on that particular map, they're all from the Conchological Society data. So see that there's still a significant number, although it's fewer. But we pride ourselves on the fact that our data is thoroughly verified and has been, as I mentioned earlier, purified to a degree that any errors have been sought out and dealt with. Not all other data sharers are as rigorous or necessarily have the sort of specific expertise that we have. So if you're particularly interested in marine mollusk distributions, it may be an idea to filter what you're looking at on NBN. And just to back that up, here's an example. The common tortoiseshell limpet, Testudinalis, which is a northern boreal species. So it's reaches the southern limit of its distribution in Britain and Ireland. And there's the map from the NBN Atlas. See, there are several records down in the southwest. Now, if you filter just for the Conchological Society data, that's what you get. So it's taken out a lot of what was misidentified or erroneously typed. Typos do happen, but you've got data which you can be fairly certain is rigorously checked and purified. And there's some further information there that Ian Smith, my colleague who I work with, who I mentioned earlier, produced about the details around the distribution of that particular species. And you can see it made an incursion south in the Victorian times, warmer weather. It pushed itself south, but has been pushed back, and we would claim that it's even retreating. You can see on the right there, in green is the southernmost limit which it achieved, and the red is its current limit. That's interesting stuff. There's another species, Phorcus lineatus, which is another southwestern specialist. You can see there, that's just the Conchological Society data displayed on the map there. Now that's a species which we're monitoring because it's tending to increase its range with climate change, certainly working its way east along the south coast. Another such species, Patella depressa. People don't necessarily appreciate how many different species of limpet we have in the UK. You can see at the top right there, there are 3 different species there, which I found all on the same stone up in the Llen Peninsula in Wales. You can see on the left there its distribution and some notes at the bottom about why, for example, it's not found in Ireland. Again, that's a species which is currently expanding its range eastwards along the south coast. Although it will be interesting to see what impacts the last very cold winter has had on that. Another interesting species, Steromphala umbilicalis, until fairly recently was in the genus Gibula. On the left there, you can see, again, that's the Conchological Society data. Now, this species isn't really known from the North Sea. Now, there are 3 dots there shown on the coast of the North Sea. Now, I've looked into those, and I think they are erroneous, so I should be removing those. Not just because they're there, I hasten to add. But if you look at the old references, they'll say that this species is not known further into the North Sea than Orkney and doesn't occur on the south coast beyond, I think, the Solent. Well, it certainly crept along the south coast in recent years. It was noted when it passed Beachy Head, and then it rounded the tip of Kent onto the north coast of Kent. Well, those specimens photographed on the right there, they were found 2 years ago in Essex. So it's certainly expanding its range. Again, likely an indicator of climate change. Now, it's not all about monitoring species changing their distributions in response possibly to climate change. It's about monitoring invasives and introductions as well. This particular species, Magellana gigas, Thostria gigas, the Pacific oyster, and that was introduced into Britain for food. And at the time, I think it was back in the 60s, there was a lot of studies done, and they said, "Oh no, it won't breed in UK waters. It's too cold." Well, as you can see from the map on the left there, it's naturalized. And as you can see from the picture on the bottom right there, certain shores are literally covered in it now. That photograph was taken about 10 years ago on Mersey Island in Essex, if any of you are familiar with that particular site. And I mean, these oysters, buy oysters to eat, these are the ones that you nearly always get. It's now well established and is becoming really quite a problem in some areas. And Rudotapes philippinarum, or palord as it's sold in fishmongers. Another species that was brought in, and studies were done, and they said, oh no, it won't survive in our water, it's too cold. And yes, it's naturalized. About the millennium, it started to take over the Thames estuary. Now you won't find another veneropid other than this species in and around the Thames estuary. It does coexist with one other species on the south coast, but it tends to be by far the dominant. And don't get me wrong, they're tasty, but they are alien and they're invasive. Another alien bivalve, the American razor shell, now known as Ensis lei. It had a number of Latin names, even just in the time that it's been present here. Now this just a buckler trend wasn't introduced by us, it introduced itself. It came over in, it's thought to have come over in as larvae in bilge tanks, which were emptied in the Dutch ports initially, where it's established, and it's spread around, and now it reaches huge proportions on some of the east coast, and it's found up in Scotland and around on the west coast as well. The bottom right there, it sometimes gets wrecked and washed up in large numbers. It can be difficult to recognize from our native species to the uneducated eye, and it does seem to inhabit slightly different habitats to our natives. So it hasn't had quite the impact that, for example, Rudotapes philippinarum had on its equivalent native species. And just to speak briefly about the photograph that was used to promote this talk, there's two species there of auger shell. And the one at the back is one that's very common in some places in Britain. Used to be called Turritella communis. Fairly recently, it was given a new name. But then very recently, this other species was discovered by a company who were doing some ecological survey work in the Channel. And fortunately, they raised our awareness to it so that we could record it and publicize it. So it's a new thing that's cropped up in the Channel. And quite a number of species are establishing themselves from the south, which are known from areas like Biscay, and they're creeping north. Again, it's climate change in action. Here's a few other sort of examples of the kind of things that crop up that we record. Top left there, you've got Isognomon, a very unusual bivalve. And what's even more unusual about that one is that it's one of these transatlantic rafting species. So it's a species that attaches itself to material, and that's attached itself to a piece of plastic which has floated across the Atlantic. Now, some of these species have actually been found alive on this material when it's been stranded on our shores. So there's every possibility that we could have one of these transatlantic rafting species actually establishing itself here. So we're monitoring those, and colleagues at the National Museum of Wales are doing a lot of study on those. I mean, most people have heard of sea beans floating across and still being viable, although not finding suitable conditions here. And I know that may well be the case with these molluscs as well, but we shall see. Time will tell. Top right there, very, very attractive sea slug. That's one of these species which is creeping north in its range and is starting to be recorded more and more frequently now in the southwest of England. Bottom left there is the delightfully named Naomiamia dolioliformis, which really trips off the tongue. It's one of these tiny, tiny gastropods. We sometimes refer to them as SWGs, small white gastropods. It's analogous of the bird watchers and their little brown jobs. These are the sorts of things that you can find in shell grits, which we were looking at earlier, and thus record. You can, if you're lucky and you know the habitat and you can find it, you can sometimes find them alive. And bottom right there, that's a species that I found recently just last month, in fact, down in Cornwall, when the Society were doing some field work there on the spring tides. I found that under a stone at very, very low tide, and got it back and looked under my microscope. Apologies for the poor quality of the image, but that's only the third time that species has been recorded in Britain and Ireland. I was very pleased to find that. And so it's at the cutting edge of marine mollusk recording. And we report these things. I write a report for the Society every year, which gets published in its magazine, Mollusc World, which has featured on Have I Got News For You? Yes. You can see there on the right-hand side, that's an extract from the report for 2021. So just quickly to close, what happens with the data? There's a little data flow chart there, which I won't dwell on in any great detail, but you can see the things that feed in are all the sources of data and data purification. So that's where we're verifying it, checking that it's all correct. And then all the arrows going out are into research. We are collating and using our expertise to check all the data, and then researchers are using it, however they source it. And it does get shared via NBN into global schemes like the GBIF, if you've heard of it. Okay, ID references. I won't go through these in detail. I know that that they will be shared as part of the recording. But if you're interested in looking at some marine molluscs, I'm afraid there is no single reference. There are lots of them. As I said right at the start, they're a very diverse group. There's lots of species. So there are lots of resources that you need to identify them. But, if you're just doing it casually, go down the bottom there, Facebook groups. Post your photographs on Facebook groups or on iRecord, and anything that's very interesting will be noted. I think I've gone on enough. I hope I've left some time for some questions. If you want to get in touch with me, you're very welcome to. There's my email address. Thank you.